There is a particular kind of night that arrives only once in a generation. Not the kind of night that announces itself loudly, or arrives with spectacle, or makes itself known through any outward display of drama. This is a quieter kind of rarity, a night that is different from all other nights in ways that are at first difficult to name, but are felt somehow in the bones, in the stillness of the air, in the way the darkness settles. This is a peaceful story drawn from the ancient scriptures, meant for rest. Let it carry you gently as you settle in for the night. The night we are thinking of was such a night. It fell over the land of Egypt, over its cities and its fields and its wide, slow river, in the way that all nights fall. Gradually, first the edge of the sky going pale, then deepening, then the first stars becoming visible, then the full weight of darkness settling over everything, the same as it had always been. And yet not the same. Something was moving through the world that night. Something that the people of Israel, who had been in Egypt for a very long time, far longer than any of them had expected or intended, had been told to prepare for. They had been given instructions, careful and specific, for how to mark this night, what to eat and how to eat it, how to dress, how to stand. They were to be ready to move. Let us begin, as the ancient story does, not with movement, but with waiting. There is a great deal of waiting in the story of the Exodus, as there is a great deal of waiting in most long stories. The people of Israel had waited in Egypt for generations, long enough that Egypt had become in some ways home, even as it was also a place of hardship and labor and diminishment, long enough that the land of Canaan, which their ancestors had been promised, had become something more like a dream than a destination. Something spoken of in the old stories, held in the long memory of a people who had learned to hold on to things that could not be taken away. They had waited, and now the waiting was coming to an end. To understand something of what this night meant, it helps to hold the landscape in the mind for a moment. Egypt, in the ancient world, was a place of extraordinary order and power. It sat in a landscape that was itself a kind of paradox. Vast desert on every side, and yet along the ribbon of the Nile, extraordinary fertility. The river made everything possible. It flooded each year with the regularity of a slow and ancient promise, leaving behind a dark and generous soil in which almost anything would grow. The people of Egypt had learned, over thousands of years, to organize their lives around this rhythm. The flooding, the planting, the harvest, the quiet dry season, and then the flooding again. The great monuments that Egypt built, its temples, its storehouses, its structures of stone that would outlast almost everything else from the ancient world. These were expressions of a civilization that believed in permanence, in order, in the enduring power of things that were made to last. The people of Israel had lived within this civilization, and alongside it and beneath it, for a very long time. They had come originally in the days of a man named Joseph, one of their own, who had risen through a long and winding path to a position of great authority in Egypt. There had been a famine in the land of Canaan, and his family had come looking for food, and they had found it, and they had stayed. That was long ago. The family had grown into a people. The welcome they had once received had changed, slowly and then more swiftly, into something else entirely. They had become, in the language of the ancient text, a labor force, builders of cities and storehouses, workers in brick and mortar under the Egyptian sun. They had cried out in their suffering, and their cry had been heard. The man God had called to speak on their behalf was Moses, a man of their own people, raised in the Egyptian court, who had fled to the wilderness and lived for many years as a shepherd, and who had been called back to Egypt from a burning bush on a holy mountain. He had returned as he was asked to return. He had spoken to Pharaoh as he was asked to speak. And the path toward this night had unfolded, slowly and with great weight, across many months and many exchanges between Moses and the Pharaoh of Egypt, exchanges in which the people's freedom was asked for and refused, and asked for again. Tonight at last, the refusal had ended. It was Pharaoh himself who summoned Moses. He sent for him in the middle of the night, not at a measured hour, not at a time of his own convenient choosing, but in the darkness, in the urgent and unguarded hours when the composure of powerful men sometimes gives way to something more elemental. Pharaoh said, "Rise up, go, you and the people of Israel, leave Egypt, take your flocks, your herds, everything you asked for, go, and as you go, ask your God to bless me also." These are remarkable words to hear from a man who had for so long refused to hear anything at all. But this night had changed things. Something had moved through Egypt in the darkness, something that had finally, quietly, overwhelmingly altered the landscape of what Pharaoh was willing to do. He was not bargaining now. He was not setting conditions. He was simply saying, "Go." And the Egyptians around the people of Israel, the ordinary people in the ordinary houses along the ordinary streets, they were saying the same thing, quietly, urgently, "Leave, please leave." Because they had felt this night also, and they wanted the people to go. There is a detail in the ancient account that is worth letting rest in the mind for a moment. The people of Israel, before they left, received gifts from their Egyptian neighbors: silver and gold, clothing, objects of value. The ancient text describes this as a kind of borrowing, though in practice it was more like a parting gift, a transfer of wealth from those who were sending to those who were leaving. The Egyptians gave freely, urged on by whatever they were feeling in that long, dark night. This detail matters, not because of the wealth itself, but because of what it suggests about the relationship between these two peoples over all those years of living alongside one another. Neighbors of a kind, workers and overseers, yes, but also people who had shared streets and water sources and the particular smallness of daily life together. The gifts were given by people who perhaps felt something in the leaving, regret or relief, or something harder to name. The people of Israel received them, and they prepared to go. For many hours, perhaps days before this night, the people of Israel had been told to be ready. Moses had given them instructions, passed down from what he had been told at the holy mountain. Instructions about how to mark this particular night. They were to eat a specific meal, prepared in a specific way. Lamb with bread made without leaven, bread that had not had time to rise, because there would be no time for rising. Bitter herbs, a reminder of the bitterness of the years behind them. They were to eat it dressed for travel, their sandals on their feet, their staffs in their hands. This was not the posture of people settling in for a long, unhurried evening. It was the posture of people who were about to walk out the door. Unleavened bread, bread without yeast, had a particular significance in this context. Yeast is a slow thing. It requires time, warmth, patience. It cannot be rushed. Bread that has risen is bread made by people who have the luxury of waiting. But the people of Israel were leaving in haste, and the bread they made that night was flat, dense, unrisen. Not because they lacked skill, but because they were already, in some deep sense, in motion. They had been in motion for a long time, in the way that a people can be in motion even while standing still, oriented toward a destination, leaning forward in their hearts, waiting for the moment when the waiting would end and the walking would begin. Tonight was that moment. The people had been living in a region of Egypt called Goshen. It lay in the northeastern part of the country, in the broad delta where the Nile spread out toward the sea, a fertile and relatively separate region where the Israelites had settled in the time of Joseph and where they had remained largely together across all the generations since. Goshen was, in its way, a kind of in-between place, Egyptian enough that its inhabitants understood the rhythms of the country around them, its language, its calendar, its customs, but distinct enough that the Israelites had been able to preserve something of themselves through all those years of living within a foreign culture. Their own stories, their own understanding of God, their own sense of who they were and where they had come from. They had held onto these things the way people hold on to things that matter, not loudly, not as a declaration, but quietly, within the household, within the family, in the words that parents said to children in the evenings and the children carried with them into their own adult lives. And now all of those households were stirring. All of those families were preparing. The whole of Goshen was quietly, deliberately, and with a kind of ordered urgency, getting ready to leave. The ancient text gives a number. It says that approximately 600,000 men left Egypt that night, and with them, their families, their children, their elderly, their households. This is a number that suggests an enormous assembly of people, not a single family or a clan or even a tribe, but an entire people on the move. The ancient world understood numbers differently than we do, and large numbers in the literature of the ancient Near East were often meant to convey magnitude and significance rather than a precise census count. Whether the number is understood literally or as an expression of great multitude, the point remains the same. This was not a small departure. This was not something that could be missed or overlooked or undone easily. This was a nation becoming itself, a people gathered out of slavery and set on the road to freedom. And with the Israelites went others. The ancient account notes that a mixed multitude left Egypt alongside the people of Israel, people from other backgrounds, other origins, who had attached themselves to this departing company and chose to leave with them. This detail is easy to pass over, but it is worth pausing beside. The Exodus was not, in this telling, an entirely clean division between one people and another. The movement out of Egypt included people who were not, by birth or lineage, part of the Israelite community. People who had decided, for whatever reasons, to cast their lot with this group that was going somewhere, leaving something, following a promise that could not yet be seen in its fullness. The people of God, from the very beginning of their journey, included more than only those who had been born into it. They walked together into the night. They did not leave empty-handed. The flocks went with them. The herds went with them. Great numbers of animals, the accumulated wealth of a people who had kept livestock across many generations in the land of Goshen. Sheep and cattle, the ancient text says, very many of them, more than could be easily counted. Animals travel at their own pace. Anyone who has ever moved livestock across any distance knows that the animals set the rhythm of the journey, not the people leading them. You cannot hurry a flock. You cannot tell a sheep to keep up or a cow to move more quickly. The animals move as they move, steadily, slowly, in their own time. And so, the exodus of Israel, for all the urgency that surrounded its beginning, would also have had this quality about it: the slow and patient rhythm of animals walking, the particular sound of many feet on dry ground, human and animal alike, the soft and continuous sound of a people in motion. This is not a sound of panic. It is a sound of purpose, of steady forward movement. One step, and then another, across the dark and cooling ground of a spring night in Egypt. The animals they took were not simply property. In the ancient world, livestock were life. They were food, clothing, the means of work, the medium of exchange, and the substance of worship. To leave without the flocks and herds would have been to leave without the means to sustain themselves in whatever lay ahead. Moses had been insistent about this from the very beginning of his negotiations with Pharaoh. When Pharaoh had tried to bargain, to allow only the people to leave, or only the men, or to leave the livestock behind, Moses had refused every compromise. Everything must go. Not a hoof, he had said, would be left behind. And so nothing was left behind. The animals moved with the people, in the darkness, and then the first pale light of the early morning, westward, and then south, out of Egypt, and into the beginning of the wilderness. There is a number in the ancient account that carries an entire history within it. The people of Israel had been in Egypt for 430 years. Let that number rest quietly for a moment. 430 years. More than 4 centuries of life in this land that was not their promised land. More than 4 centuries of births and deaths and marriages and children and seasons and harvests. More than 4 centuries of becoming in some ways Egyptian, while also remaining, in some deep and persistent way, themselves. 430 years ago, when the first of them had come to Egypt in the time of Joseph, the world was entirely different. The great empires of the ancient Near East were arranged differently. Languages were spoken that would later be forgotten. The land of Canaan, which they were now walking toward, was a different place than it would be when they arrived. And yet they arrived at this night, having held on to something across all of that time. The stories of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, the memory of a covenant, a promise made by God to their ancestors, a promise that had not yet been fully fulfilled, a promise that, on this very night, was now beginning to be fulfilled. There is something very gentle and very sturdy about a people who can hold a promise for 400 years and still believe it. The ancient text marks this moment with a specific kind of attention. It says that at the end of 430 years, on that very day, on that very night, the hosts of God went out from Egypt. On that very day, as if to say, not a day early, not a day late, in the fullness of the appointed time, in the moment that had been moving toward this since the beginning of the story, since Abraham, since Isaac, since Jacob, since Joseph, since the long, patient centuries of waiting and endurance. On that very night, there is a reverence in this precision, a sense that the large movements of history are not random, not accidental, not driven purely by the decisions of the people involved, but are held within a larger purpose, moving toward appointed moments with the slow and unhurried certainty of a river moving toward the sea. The people walked out, and the night received them. The first road the people of Israel walked was not a remote desert track. It was a known road, a traveled road, one of the main routes that connected Egypt to the lands to its northeast and east. But the ancient account notes that God did not lead the people by the most direct route. The shortest path from Egypt to the land of Canaan would have taken them along the northern coast, through the land of the Philistines. A shorter journey, a more traveled one, a path that would have brought them to their destination more quickly. They were not led that way. The ancient text offers a reason for this, stated simply and without elaboration, because that road would have brought them too quickly into conflict, and the people were not yet ready for what they might encounter there. A longer way was chosen, south and east, through the wilderness, through terrain that was open and stark and demanding. The wilderness, again. As with Moses at the burning bush, as with the long years in Goshen, the wilderness appears again as a place of passage, not the destination, but the space between the leaving and the arriving, a place of transformation, a threshold through which a people must walk in order to become who they are meant to be. They turned away from the shorter road and faced the longer one. There is something quietly instructive in this, though not as a lesson to be pressed upon, simply as a detail to notice, in the way one notices the shape of a stone or the way light falls through a window. The journey worth making is not always the shortest journey. The road that leads to the deepest arrival sometimes curves away from the most obvious path and winds through territory that is slower and harder and more revealing than any shortcut could be. The people of Israel did not know this yet. They were walking into the wilderness for the first time, in the dark, carrying their unleavened bread and their flocks and their borrowed silver and their 400 years of accumulated life in Egypt. They did not know what was ahead. They only knew that they were moving at last and that they were not moving alone. As the people moved, they were not without guidance. The ancient account speaks of something that went before them, a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire by night, a visible, present sign of the one who had brought them out of Egypt, moving ahead of them, marking the way, giving them light in the darkness so that they could travel day or night. This image, the pillar of cloud and fire, is one of the most enduring images in the long story of the Exodus. It appears not as a symbol to be interpreted, but simply as a presence. There it was, ahead of them, a column of something, luminous, strange and real, going before them through the wilderness. In a landscape without roads or signs or cities, navigation is a complex thing. The wilderness of Sinai is vast, and much of it looks, to an eye that does not know it, like everything else around it. Stone and sky and horizon repeating in every direction. To have something to follow, something that moved, something that was ahead of you, something that could be seen. This was not a small gift. The pillar did not hurry them. It did not drive them from behind. It went before them, and they followed. There is a particular quality to following something, as distinct from being pushed. When something leads from ahead, you move toward it. You keep your eyes on it. Your pace is set not by urgency from behind, but by the sight of what lies before you. Steady, patient, present. The people of Israel followed the pillar through the night and into the morning, and through the long days of walking that lay ahead. They did not always follow well. There would be moments in the long story of complaint and discouragement and fear. That is also part of the account, and it is told honestly. But for now, in this first night of freedom, they walked, and the pillar went before them, and the desert received their footsteps, and the darkness held them as they moved through it, and somewhere ahead lay the land that had been promised to their ancestors more than 400 years before. They did not know how long it would take to get there. They only knew they had begun. The people of Israel carried something with them out of Egypt that was not livestock, and not silver, and not clothing. They carried bones. The ancient account notes this specifically, that Moses, before leaving, gathered the bones of Joseph. Joseph, the one who had brought their ancestors to Egypt all those centuries ago. Joseph, who had died in Egypt, but who had, before he died, made the people swear an oath. When God brings you out of this land, carry my bones with you. He had known, or believed, or trusted, that the day of leaving would come. He had not known when. He had not lived to see it, but he had asked to be part of it, even in death, to be carried along on the journey that he had not been alive to make. And so Moses gathered the bones of Joseph, and they were carried out of Egypt along with everything else, among the company of hundreds of thousands of people walking north and east through the dark. There is something very tender in this detail. The living carrying the long dead, a promise kept to a man who had been in his grave for 4 centuries. The thread of obligation and memory and faithfulness stretching all the way back from this walking people to that single man who had trusted in something he could not see. The bones of Joseph would travel the entire length of the wilderness journey, through 40 years of wandering, through all the long unfolding of that story, the water from the rock, the bread that fell from the sky, the covenant at the mountain, the long, slow schooling of a people in how to be free. Through all of it, the bones went along. Joseph had asked to be brought home, and home he would be brought eventually in the fullness of time, when the people finally crossed the Jordan and set foot in the land of the promise. This is a long fidelity, the kind that does not depend on immediacy or convenience, the kind that holds a promise and keeps it simply because a promise was made, and promises are worth keeping. The people who carried those bones were, in this small act, practicing the kind of faithfulness they would need for everything else that lay ahead. The people did not walk all night without stopping. The ancient account tells us that the first camp was at a place called Succoth, a name that simply means booths or shelters in the Hebrew language, the kind of temporary structures that travelers and workers in the ancient Near East would erect for shade and shelter during a journey or a harvest season. Succoth was not far from where they had started. It was the first stopping place, the first camp, the first collective rest of a people who had only just begun to move. They arrived there as the night gave way to morning, or perhaps as the morning gave way to midday, and they stopped. There is something very human in this first stopping place. After the urgency of the night, after the long preparation, after the word from Pharaoh, the gathering of the flocks, the borrowed silver, the bones of Joseph, and the millions of footsteps walking, here they stopped and rested. Sukkoth, a place of temporary shelters, a name that suggests impermanence, transience, the fragility of a dwelling made for a night and then left behind. This would become, in the memory of Israel, a kind of recurring theme, the willingness to dwell in temporary shelters, to rest without permanence, to trust that the journey continues even when the shelter is only for the night. At Sukkoth, they ate. The bread they had brought was unleavened, flat, dense and simple, baked in haste before they left, or perhaps still being baked on the morning of departure, carried out of the ovens before it had time to rise. This bread, which was nothing like the bread of settled life, was the first food of freedom. It would be remembered, this bread, remembered and reenacted year after year in the generations that followed, as a way of tasting again what that first morning had tasted like. The simplicity of it, the plainness, the flavor that is not sweet but is satisfying in its own way, the flavor of a meal eaten by people who are moving, who are leaving something behind, who are leaning forward into what is ahead. They sat among their temporary shelters and ate their unleavened bread and rested their feet, and the morning light of Egypt, the particular golden clarity of a spring morning in the delta, lay over everything. It was the first morning of a new chapter. It looked, in many ways, like any other morning, and yet everything had changed. Let us pause here, in the stillness of the morning at Sukkoth, and let the mind rest on what lay behind them. Egypt was still there, of course. The great monuments, the river, the fields and the cities, still there exactly as they had been. The world does not vanish simply because you have left it. What had been left behind remained. The places where they had worked, the storehouses and building sites, the brickyards, the rows of labor under the Egyptian sun. These remained also, empty now, or perhaps already being filled with different workers. The physical evidence of all those years of labor still standing in the landscape of Egypt, outlasting the people who had made it. The people of Israel were walking away from all of it, not running, walking, with their children, animals, and their elderly, their borrowed silver, the bones of their ancestor and the flat bread that was already in their hands. They were not looking back, or perhaps some of them were, with a particular complicated feeling that comes from leaving a place that has both harmed you and held you, a place that is familiar even in its difficulty, a place that is, after all, the only home most of them had ever known. Egypt was the only Egypt they had, and they were leaving it. There is no record in the ancient text of grief at the departure. The dominant note of the Exodus, in the way it was told and remembered, is one of relief and release, the beginning of freedom. These were real. The suffering had been real. The deliverance from it was real. And the lightness of leaving is real in the story. But lives are layered, and 40 years in Egypt, or 80, or 200. Each generation that had lived and died in that land had left something behind too. Graves, places where people had been born, streets that were familiar underfoot, neighbors who had become, in some cases, friends. The departure was a release, and it was also a leaving. Both things can be true at once, and the ancient story holds space for both without pressing either too hard. The people walked. The morning was quiet. The shelters at Sukkoth held them for a little while. And then they would walk again. The ancient account uses a phrase for this particular night that has been carried forward across all the generations since. It calls the night of the Exodus a night of vigil, or, in the older translations, a night of watching. A night in which God kept watch over the people of Israel as they came out of Egypt. A night marked and set apart, different from all other nights, to be remembered and kept in memory by the people and their descendants forever. A vigil is a keeping watch, a staying awake through the dark hours, an attentiveness to what is happening in the night. There is something in the word that suggests both vigilance and tenderness, the watchfulness of someone who is keeping guard, but also the watchfulness of someone who simply wants to be present while the night passes. The people of Israel, leaving Egypt in the dark, were held within such a watch. They were not alone in the wilderness, not unobserved, not left to find their own way through the night without any accompaniment. They were watched over, the ancient text says, by the one who had heard their crying and had acted to bring them out. This night of vigil was to be kept in memory by the people, not just the first generation, but every generation after them. A night to be set apart and observed year after year as a way of returning, in memory and in practice, to this original night, a way of saying, we remember, we were slaves, we were brought out, we were watched over in the darkness, we are here because of what happened on that night. This observance would become one of the oldest and most continuous of Israel's holy days. The Passover, the night of watching, the memorial of the Exodus, observed in households for more than 3,000 years, with the flat unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, the retelling of the story and the prayers that have been said by so many millions of people over so many long centuries that the prayers themselves have become, in a way, a form of permanence. The people who left Egypt that night could not have known this. They did not know how long the story would last, or how far it would travel, or how many generations would sit at tables in faraway countries and remember this departure They only knew they were leaving. The camp at Succoth was a beginning, not an ending. When the rest was done and the people rose and gathered their things and called to their animals and shouldered what they carried, the road stretched out before them again, not toward Egypt, not back, forward, toward the wilderness, toward the long, difficult, and ultimately transforming journey that lay ahead. The wilderness of Sinai is not a hospitable place. It is beautiful in its austerity, as many hard places are beautiful. The clarity of the light, the stark geometry of the stone, the immensity of the sky. But it does not give itself easily. Water must be found or provided. Food must come from somewhere. Shade is rare and wind is constant, and the ground is unforgiving underfoot. A people numbering in the hundreds of thousands, with flocks and herds, children and the elderly. All the accumulated weight of their Egyptian life. Such a people would not travel quickly through this landscape. They would travel slowly, deliberately, at the pace of the smallest and the slowest among them. This is the pace of a community, not the pace of soldiers or couriers who travel light and fast, but the pace of ordinary life on the move. The elderly grandmother who needs to rest more often, the young children who tire and must sometimes be carried, the pregnant woman walking carefully, the flock that stops to graze wherever it can find grass. At this pace, the journey to the promised land would take time, much more time than the distance alone would suggest. But the pace is also, in its own way, a grace. A people that moves at the pace of its most vulnerable members is a people that has decided, at some deep level, that it will leave no one behind, that the journey belongs to all of them, not only to the strong or the swift. That arrival means nothing if the whole community does not arrive together. This is a quiet kind of value, not easily stated as a principle, more easily seen in practice, in the fact that they walked at the pace they walked, that the flocks were counted, the children accounted for, the elderly supported, and the sick attended to, as best they could be, along the road. The Exodus was not a retreat. It was not a flight. It was, in the way the ancient text tells it, a procession, ordered, purposeful, held together by more than just shared origin or shared destination, held together by the fact of what they had been through, of what they were moving toward, and of who was going before them. The pillar of cloud and fire went ahead. They followed. Egypt, behind them, was beginning to comprehend what had happened. The ancient texts do not dwell on this, and we will not dwell on it either. There is enough in the leaving itself to carry this story toward rest, but it is worth noting gently that the night that had been so full of urgency and departure for the people of Israel had also been a night of great weight for the Egyptians. Pharaoh had sent for Moses in the middle of the night and told him to go. This was not the sending of a man at peace, or a man who had made his decision calmly and in advance. This was the sending of a man who had been overwhelmed by the night, and who, in his overwhelming, had said what Moses had been asking him to say for a long time. The Egyptians who had given their silver and their gold to the departing Israelites had done so, the ancient text says, willingly, even urgently. They wanted the people to go. They were afraid, in a way that is not fully explained in the text, but is felt in the account. A low and pervasive fear, something that had moved through the land and left nothing unchanged. The morning after the Exodus was a morning unlike other mornings in Egypt. The landscape was the same. The river was the same. The stone monuments stood exactly where they had always stood. But the people who had built so much of that landscape were gone. Let us slow here and let the story settle around us like the quiet of a late evening. The people of Israel are in the wilderness now. Behind them is Egypt. 430 years of life in that country, 4 centuries of labor and suffering, and also, in quieter moments, of family, memory, and the small consolations of daily life. Before them is the wilderness, and beyond the wilderness, the land of promise. They are between. There is a kind of rest in that image, if we let it be what it is. Not rest as the absence of movement, but rest as the suspension of having to know exactly where you are or exactly what comes next. The people were in motion, and the motion was purposeful, and the direction was set. The pillar was ahead of them. The road was under their feet. They did not need to know all of what lay ahead. They did not need to have arrived yet. They were between, and in that betweenness, they were still watched over and still provided for, still held within the purpose that had brought them this far. This is a gentle thing to carry into sleep, the sense that being between the leaving and the arriving, between the question and the answer, between the difficulty that was and the wholeness that is coming, is not the same as being lost. The betweenness has its own ground, its own sky, its own stars visible above the wilderness at night. Night had come again by the time the camp at Sukkot was settled. The first full night of freedom, not the night of leaving. That had been something else, something extraordinary, something dense with meaning and movement. But this night, the second night, the first quiet night, was something different. The animals were settled, the children were sleeping, the fires were low. The stars above the wilderness of Sinai were extraordinary in their multitude and their clarity, as they always are in that part of the world, away from the light of cities, in the open desert air. Great rivers of stars overhead, and the deep dark between them. The people who were still awake sat quietly, or perhaps spoke quietly to one another, or perhaps simply looked up at the sky above them and held in their hearts everything they were feeling, which was more than any of them had words for yet. Freedom is like that at first. It does not always feel the way you expected it to feel. Sometimes it feels simply like tiredness and hunger and the strange lightness of a burden just lifted. Sometimes it takes a while for the full weight of what has happened to find its way from the facts of the situation into the body, into the breath, into the quiet certainty that something has genuinely changed. The people rested. The wilderness held them. The pillar, still present, cast its light over the camp, soft and steady, not like the harsh light of day, but like a gentler illumination, a reminder that the watching had not stopped, that the night did not mean absence. They were not alone, even in the dark. There is a strand in the ancient story that is easy to overlook, but worth bringing gently forward in the quietness of this hour. The people who left Egypt left as a whole people, The text is careful about this. Not just the young and strong, not just the men, not just those who are well enough to travel easily. The whole community, children, elderly, animals, those who carried and those who needed to be carried. This kind of leaving is slow. It is, by any military or logistical measure, inefficient. It would have been faster, and in some ways simpler, to leave the most vulnerable behind, or to move them separately at a different pace. That is not what happened. What happened was this. The community moved as a community. It kept itself together. It made itself responsible for its own wholeness, its own completeness, its own refusal to fragment in the face of difficulty. A people that holds together across 400 years of suffering and then holds together again in the difficulty of a wilderness crossing is a people that has learned something very deep about what community means. It is more than geography and more than shared origin. It is a daily practice renewed in every act of staying, of slowing, of turning back to help the one who has fallen behind. And what stayed in Egypt, the labor, the monuments, the anonymous hundreds of years of building, that stayed. It cannot be reclaimed. It cannot be unmade. The storehouses and the structures remain, testimony to work that was done and was real, even in conditions that were wrong. But the people went with it, their lives, their stories, their knowledge of who they were. These went along. These were not left behind. The future belonged to the living people walking north into the wilderness, not to the stone that would outlast them. There is a kind of peace in this. The work that was done under conditions of suffering is real. It is not nothing, but it does not define the people who did it. The people are more than their labor. They are more than what was taken from them. They go forward carrying themselves and the bones of their beloved dead into whatever is next. The ancient account closes its description of the Exodus night with a phrase that has echoed across all the centuries since. It was a night of watching, a night kept by God for the people, a night to be kept by the people in its memory for all their generations. Not a monument, not a structure, not something made of stone that can be seen from a distance and will outlast the people who built it. A night, something made of time and memory and practice, the kind of memorial that lives in people, not in objects, the kind that is renewed every time a family gathers and tells the story again and eats the flatbread and says, "We were there, we were brought out. This night belongs to us, and we belong to it." 3,000 years and more of families gathering to tell this story. The story traveling in the mouths and hearts and memories of people from Egypt to Sinai to Canaan to Babylon to Rome to Spain to Poland to every corner of the world where the descendants of these walkers eventually came to live. The story traveling and adapting and deepening and remaining through all of it, recognizably itself. This is what a night of watching becomes when it is kept faithfully across the generations. It becomes something like permanence, not the permanence of stone, but the permanence of meaning. The thing that endures not because it is carved into the unchanging earth, but because it is told again and again by people who find in the telling something they need. We were slaves. We were brought out. We are here. Let the story settle now, the way dust settles in the still air of an evening. The people of Israel are in their camp at Succoth. The fires are low, the animals are quiet, the children are sleeping. The stars above the Sinai wilderness are clear and countless, turning slowly in their ancient paths, indifferent to history and yet somehow present to it. Witnesses, if stars can be witnesses, to everything that has ever happened under them. The pillar is still there, quiet, luminous, unhurried, going nowhere tonight, because tonight there is nowhere to go, simply present as a reminder that the watching continues, that the darkness does not mean the end of guidance, that the next step will be shown when it is time to take it. Moses is somewhere in the camp, perhaps asleep, perhaps still awake, sitting with everything that has come to pass. The years of labor in the wilderness at Midian, the burning bush, the long months of standing before Pharaoh, and now this. Hundreds of thousands of people camping in the wilderness on the first night of their freedom. He had not entirely understood, perhaps, what he was saying yes to when he said yes at the mountain. None of us entirely understand what we are saying yes to until we are living inside it. But he is here, and the people are here, and the night is quiet. Let the wilderness be what it is, open, vast, a little cold now that the sun has gone down, the stones still holding some warmth from the day's heat, but giving it up slowly to the night air. The kind of cold that is not uncomfortable so much as clarifying, the kind that makes the stars seem closer, the kind that makes a fire welcome, the kind that draws a community together around whatever warmth it has made for itself. Let the flat bread be what it is, simple, honest, sufficient. Not the bread of abundance or celebration, the bread of a people who did not have time to wait, who were already in motion before the baking was done, who learned that plain things can sustain life as surely as elaborate ones. Let the bones of Joseph be where they are, carried carefully, wrapped and held, traveling with the people toward the burial they were promised. Patient, as the dead are patient, waiting for the arrival that will not be hurried. Let the mixed multitude settle for the night alongside the people of Israel, the ones who came not by birth but by choice, who cast their lot with this departing company and walked with them into the wilderness. They are part of the community now. They will learn the stories and eat the flat bread and keep the night of watching in their own way, in their own households, in the generations to come. Let everything rest now. The long story is old and full and true. It has been carried by more people than can be counted, across more distance than can be walked, through more years than any living person can span. The people walked out of Egypt in the night, and the night received them, and the wilderness received them, and the God who had watched over them in their suffering, watched over them also in their freedom. That watching has not stopped. It did not stop at the border of Egypt. It did not stop when the wilderness became difficult, or when the people faltered, or when the years of wandering stretched out longer than anyone had hoped. It continued through the crossing of the sea and the giving of the covenant and the building of the tabernacle and the death of Moses at the edge of the promised land. It continued into the land itself, through all the centuries of its long and complicated habitation. It continues still, quiet and steady, a pillar that goes before, a presence that fills the night with something other than darkness. Let the breath slow now, Let the body rest where it is. Let the weight of whatever today carried settle gently downward, the way weight does when we finally stop holding it. The story is complete. The night of watching is remembered. The flatbread was eaten. The bones of Joseph were carried. The pillar went before them, and the wilderness opened to receive their footsteps, and the stars turned slowly above the camp at Sokoth on the first quiet night of freedom. I have brought you out. You will not walk alone. The road is before you, and I am going ahead. This is enough for tonight, more than enough. The stars are turning. The wilderness is still. The camp is quiet. The fire is low, warm, and sufficient. Rest now. Whatever you are carrying tonight, it is held. The night is held. You are held. Breathe in, breathe out. Let the silence settle like a kindness. Let the dark be gentle. Let sleep come the way it comes when we stop pressing against it. Quietly, patiently, the way morning comes. Not all at once, but gradually. First one degree of light and then another, until you are simply there, in the rest you needed, held in the night that holds you. The story goes on. The journey continues. But tonight there is only this: the wilderness, the stars, the quiet camp, the pillar, soft and present, going before, and the people resting at last on the first long night of freedom. Be still, sleep. Amen.